Good day, everyone. Welcome back to the Say la Vie Podcast, episode 7. Time is going by so fast. What is happening? Throughout this podcast, we've spoken a lot about discrimination and the different forms and faces it takes on. And today, we're going to continue building a bigger picture of those different forms of discrimination by talking about racism. There are so many different forms of discrimination within the context of racism alone. And in a lot of instances, those acts of discrimination are faced by many other communities, whether it's sexism or social class or ageism or homophobia. So in today's episode, we're going to be speaking to 2 youth members with different backgrounds to speak about their experiences of discrimination and racism within the province of Quebec. It's my hope that with every episode, as we continue to paint a bigger picture of what these different forms of discrimination look like, we will get a much clearer idea of the true state of inequalities within this province. With that said, I'm very excited to bring you today's episode on racism. We have an excellent conversation with 2 members of my podcast advisory committee. These are 2 members that have helped make these past episodes what they are. So I'd like to give a big thanks to them and everyone else who is a part of the advisory committee. While brainstorming ideas for this episode and talking points and ways to present it that really capture the overall essence of how racism feels in Quebec was a bit difficult when you start to piece together experiences from around the province. Because I can sit here and talk to you for hours of times that I got stopped unjustly at an airport, or the time when I was the only one stopped at a concert that had to be taken to the side for special screening. And as heartbreaking and valid as those experiences are, it's not a stretch to say that we all know someone or have heard of someone that's gone through something very similar. Don't get me wrong, it is just as important to continue to have those conversations and keep those stories heard. But today I wanted to talk a bit about the stories that we don't hear every day, the perspectives of racism, the lived experiences of racism that we don't get to hear about. And as Liana mentioned last week, one of the best ways we can support each other is by educating ourselves on the communities that surround us. And I think this is a perfect way to segue in today's episode. Building from what we learned last time, we know that these isolated incidents of discrimination can make people feel like they don't belong. And that's horrifying because one of the messages we've been trying to drill home every week is that we are representatives of Quebec's identity and Quebec's culture. By living here, we are as valuable and as a part of this province as anyone else. Though sometimes it can get difficult to see that, it's 100% true nonetheless. So without further ado, I'd love to jump into this conversation. Huda, Cecilia, let the world know who you are, and let's jump right in.
Hi, my name is Huda Kirkadi. I work at a non-profit organization called Le Depot. And in my free time, I'm a writer for Diaspora, which is an African women collective media platform. So yeah, that's what I do.
I'm Cecilia Marangon and I'm a journalist. I do have an Italian podcast called Democrazia Portami Via. You can translate it as Democracy Brings Me Away. And we talk about European and Italian policies mostly.
That's wonderful. Thank you guys both for being here. Huda, I want to start off by asking you, because you had this brilliant idea of silent, unspoken racism. What are some of the things that you would see as silent or unspoken racism in the province of Quebec?
I originally made this comment because I work in the nonprofit field, and one of the things is I work with immigrants and refugees and people whose English and French are not necessarily their first language, even the people working in those nonprofits. So for me, the conversation of systemic racism is really ignored in the nonprofit field because of this of how money is distributed. Because the way it works is that these organizations have funding, right? They've opened up these fundings where they're like, if you're gonna apply, you can apply to X, Y, Z, and you can get like $20,000, $30,000. Like these are available to you. However, it comes with a catch that you have to write this grant application, and that for me is one of the biggest barriers that no one speaks about, because you can get these funds, but it's under this understanding that you're going to write an amazing grant application, either in excellent English or excellent French. And now if we're going to put this in context of Quebec, in context where it's immigrants who usually open these centers, and it's immigrants that usually work there, they don't necessarily have this background in English literature. And even let's say if they were to get someone to write it, a grant writer usually takes like $1,000, $1,500, and that's a lot. If you're applying to these funds, first of all, you don't have a fund for a grant writer. And if you do, it's just an added barrier. And the questions itself are questions primarily to do with identity, and they're questions of like what kind of populations you serve and what kind of and who are you yourself. Like these barriers of having a grant application, which by the way I've worked on several, and they're like 1,000, 2,000 words each. Like this is not a simple thing. For me, as a conversation that's really ignored is these invisible barriers that no one speaks about. We hear that XYZ $20 million have been put in this fund, but the question then becomes, how are they disseminated? I mean, if we've given so much money to these topics, why haven't things been solved? And that's where we have to account for these invisible barriers.
Absolutely. And from your experience, are there mainly immigrant families that take advantage of these programs?
Yeah, to be honest, in my experience, yeah, it's mostly them, or it's single parent families and stuff like that. But like community organizations in general, that they cater to immigrants usually. So it could be an accurate statement to say that.
And so that's interesting to then think that if you think of every single community that there is in Quebec, right, there's probably a lot of racism experienced. And you guys are a sample of a vast population of people that have experienced racism. I have experienced racism. And it's important to talk about these things. And people kind of shy away from it. But it's because of these conversations that we can normalize the idea that racism exists. And so, Cecilia, you had an interesting perspective on this as well. And you were talking to me a bit about something like housing. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's one of the things that happens when you're not, let's say, you don't respond to the stereotype of what the lender wants a tenant to be. General example is not only the skin color that unfortunately is still an enormous mark and an enormous reason of discrimination, which objectively speaking doesn't make any sense, but it's even more regarding, going towards your name. When you sign a lease, you have to write down your name and surname, right? And if your name and surname, it's not an Anglophone or Francophone name and surname, sometimes, the lender will be, let's say, less accommodating with you, will ask you more information, maybe private information that doesn't have the right to ask you, will ask you for extra deposits, which again, they don't have the legal rights to, but you are an international student, you're an immigrant, you're an international worker. What grants me that you're going to be like a good Quebec tenant? Then it's an enormous problem. Then also, the everyday racism that it's not that much talked about, that probably all of us have experienced. It's not only, someone shooting in the street or in the mall or in a place, because those are enormous tragedy that we need to work for avoiding. But there's the everyday racism. I think I made the example of the pharmacist looking at you weirdly when you say your name. Like when I ask for my medicines, I have to pronounce my name in the French version so that they could understand, or I will have to spend 20 minutes explaining my name.
It's this idea of bias towards names it's shocking how strong it is. I remember when I started CEGEP, I had a terribly difficult time finding a job, and so that kind of inspired me in one of my psychology classes to use the projects to kind of do a little bit of a social experiment. I printed out 50 CVs. 25 of those CVs I put the name Sampreet Arnesia. 25 of those CVs I put the name Sam Arnesia. Sampreet means love everyone equally. Sam, Preet. Preet means love. So I love that name. I think that's a wonderful name. But a lot of my friends call me Sam, and I get it. And I love the name Sam as well. So I handed out those 25 CVs and the other 25 CVs, and I wanted to see which one would I get more results from? Which one will I get a bunch of callbacks from? And I found that people significantly called me back. And I'm talking same types of jobs. So McDonald's, Tim Hortons, like Wendy's, this was CEGEP people. I didn't have many standards. I just needed money. Despite that, people looked at the name Sam Arnesia and gave that kid a chance more than they did to Sampreet Arnesia. And it made for a super, super interesting study that I couldn't publish or do anything about. But it just goes to show how much mental bias there is. And even if it's subconscious or you don't even realize, you can go up to any of those employers and ask them if they're racist, and they will so strongly stand against racism. But then situations like that happen all the time. It's written in our brains, and I feel like it's a process that we have to get to unlearn these things.
It's a cultural problem because it's inside everybody's culture. To give you an example, just from my personal experience, I'm here in Canada, in Quebec, since August 2018. I lost count of the amount of times in which I've been asked if I have any relationship with mafia just because I'm Italian. Now, you would think that after, I don't know, more than a century of Italian immigration towards North America, they would give up with that. They haven't yet. The second question usually is like, do you vote for Berlusconi? And I'm like, would you stop this stereotype conversation with me?
I was recently doing research into North Africans in Montreal and their job search, and I found that in job applications, when they apply, they're 3 times less likely to be called back if they have a North African sounding name in Montreal. I found that a crazy statistic. Just from the sheer amount of North Africans, you would think at some point they would have accepted it, but apparently not.
And to like deepen this conversation, I've worked with a lot of individuals who have come from different places around the world, right? Like immigrant workers. When I was working as a supervisor at Tim Hortons, I remember talking to these individuals about some of their work experiences because they're only granted, I think it's 20 hours of work.
Student visa for international students is 20 hours limited off campus and full-time on campus, but you can work full-time during academic vacations. From the perspective of someone that used to be an international student that, pays for her own rent and stuff, sure, give me the chance to work as much as I can and I will. On the other side, is it fair that I spend my vacation working full-time while the rest of the year I'm not allowed to work full-time?
But if we tie this into what we were talking about earlier, people that have, ethnic names or names that are more against the grain, right, if we can say, those people have a harder time finding jobs. So these immigrants that are coming that already have a very limited amount of work that they can do have a horrible time finding work. And so there was a lot of students that I spoke to when I was working at Tim Hortons, and international students who then had to work were kind of treated a bit more rudely. Were treated a bit more as if they were expendable, right? And it's sad because they know that those immigrant students need that work because it's so hard to find a job. And I genuinely did not understand why those students would work under those conditions. So when they were telling me some of the more horrific stories, they said there's so many things that happen when you try to find a job as an immigrant worker. There's so much mistrust and harassment that, when you find something that is not hard work, even if they scream at you, you just put up with it because it's so hard to find a job.
For me, this does not surprise me because Quebec in itself has a problem in which we've deluded ourselves that we're super diverse and we're super accepting. And this is, in general, we know this is a Canada problem, but we fail to see past identity politics. We fail to see past this idea that just because we bring all these people, all these immigrants in, just because we represent them on our ads, on billboards as we see, that does not mean that the system accommodates them. And this is why it does not shock me that so many things slip into the crack, because we've never actually changed our systems in a way that actually accommodates them. So like one of the things that when I was doing research a couple of years ago into the Syrian refugees who came here from 2016, if you just see their plan for how they were for their integration, you'd be shocked. Not only were they put in the most expensive cities in Canada, and no one accounted for that. Second of all, no one actually saw that they were actually employed. No one saw that there was economic integration. When they were put in Quebec, no one followed through with their French lessons. And I feel like this is what happens when you put such an emphasis on identity rather than integration. And this, for me, is if Quebec were to actually tackle an issue next, it has to be the fact that their system just does not accommodate. Is when we look at countries like America or in France, who honestly have glaring and violent problems with racism. Us in Canada, we tend to not look in our backyard because we're like, oh, we're not like them. We're never going to get as bad as them. But we fail to realize that both in France and in America, we have the same exact frameworks as them. We don't differ that much from them. The only thing is that their problems have just escalated much faster than us. But to be honest, Canada is heading in a very similar trajectory. We're not exempt from what's happening from them. It could very easily be us next.
And
it depends always, from when you face if you face and how you face the issue. Because again, if you don't even accept to call the problem with its own name, you're never going to find a solution. There's plenty of debate. Is it systemic racism? Is it not systemic? It's systemic because it's part of the cultural system of Quebec, for which, for being a Quebecer, you cannot be whatever else. If you are something else, then you're not Quebec enough, which sucks because I'm Italian and I can be easily Quebec without any issue. But I don't have to give up my Italian being. That's the point. And it shouldn't even be a conversation, the fact that I'm Italian or not, unless I want to have a conversation about my country and my culture.
Not to boil down what you guys are saying, but it seems that we are arriving to this conclusion of the idea of education. And I think the idea of exposure and education in a lot of these places, the people you're surrounded with, the ideas and thoughts and mentalities that you're surrounded with really grow into who you become. And it's in psychology, there's this whole debate on nature versus nurture. And it's becoming more and more evident that nurturing plays a big role in forming racism. We're not born being racist. We grow and we learn from our environments. And so if I were to provide one bit of advice to anybody who, feels a bit of discrimination or, has some sort of fears or concerns about a culture that you just simply don't know that much about, I'd implore you to learn about that culture. There's something to love about every culture and every community, and it's just a matter about educating yourself on it and taking the time to learn, because that's one of the biggest issues is we just don't take the time to learn. So to wrap this up, I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think can be done differently to improve? And not just by the people in power, but also for the individuals, for the people that are experiencing racism. What advice do you have for them? Or alternatively, for people that are finding themselves discriminating and beginning to come to terms with it and starting to realize it. What advice do you have for them to grow out of that?
We're not born racist. So to be honest, I would say that the problem boils down to our education system. We need to start bringing these conversations in. And I'm thinking mostly nonprofits who are now working in schools. And what they're doing is doing workshops on like racism with younger kids and really nurturing this emotional intelligence in which they're able to recognize these problems. From the government standpoint, there only is one solution, is to acknowledge systemic racism. Because until we acknowledge systemic racism, we're going to be running around misdiagnosing everything and wondering why the medication doesn't work. You have to be looking in the right places to fix the problem of racism in Quebec. Yeah.
And I think we're starting to see a bit of a paradigm shift in that sense, because in the past year, there's been so many diverse, ethnically, culturally diverse people that are running for politics. And we're seeing it, like, for example, Jagmeet Singh. I know he's a polarizing figure. A lot of people love him, and a lot of people, without any reason, just hate him. And as someone who looks at his brown skin every single morning, it's so empowering to see someone like that stand up for values that were taught since we were kids as Indian children. So to see that, and to see that we're slowly starting to see a paradigm shift in the representation we have in politics, I'm hoping that one day through this diversification we'll have enough voices to speak for enough perspectives to be able to have a just and more representative political system.
There are a couple of things, like, you can realize that sometimes in life you have been racist without meaning to be. It's fine. It happens. It's not just your fault. It's the culture you grew up in. So you didn't understand it was a problem. Once you understand it, you can apologize and then move on, first of all. And second, if you're a victim of racism, call it out. Because it's not you the problem. Is the person that is making the racist joke, is the person that is calling you a racist name that has an issue, not you. You are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with you. It's the other one. So you can point your finger and this is a racist thing, what you said. Please apologize and don't do it again. Period.
So it's about standing up for each other. And I think that that's a great way to end it. And that's a great note to end on. We, as a community, need each other to support each other, right? We have to build a foundation on support for one another. So if you do have knowledge on other cultures, and if you can educate someone that is being racist, and if you can tell them, hey, what you're doing is wrong, then that's the way we're going to grow from here. That's the way we can all help build each other to a more respectful and accepting community in the future. So I want to thank you guys for a wonderful, super intriguing conversation. Tell them where you can find you. Tell them a bit about your podcast. Tell them what you have going on in your life.
You can reach me on Spotify or Anchor, Democrazia Portami Via, if you're interested into what happens in Europe.
You can check out my articles on sayaspora.com.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Thank you so much, Huda. And I want to thank everybody, a part of the Podcast Advisory Committee, for helping make this podcast what it is. I wouldn't be able to do it without you guys. As always, we have some great local Quebec talent here for you at the end of this episode. But before we end it off, I want to reiterate something. We are all in this together. And I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record. For those of us that feel these experiences, nothing is more valuable than to know that we're not alone. And this applies to those that are experiencing racism or homophobia or xenophobia or any form of discrimination. To know that we're not alone, to know that we have people that have our back, there's just nothing more comforting than that. And so if we can start seeing each other as a part of the same team and appreciate this mosaic for the richness and its diversity, but also acknowledge that in the bigger picture, we all form this province. We all form its identity. And so through loving each other and helping each other grow to being the people that we want to be, feeling affirmed in our identity and feeling affirmed in our belonging, that's the only true way we're going to grow together and build this province to what we all want to see it become. And with that, friends, I'll leave you. As always, I will be providing a list of resources for the musicians in this podcast, as well as the speakers, so you can find their other ventures. As always, these resources will include services that are available to you, and my email and contact information will be below if there's anything you need to talk about, or if there was anything you feel that we missed. And now, to end off this episode, we have a song called Dreams by Benjamin Vigny Pau and Prempeh.
Cursed from day one, the choice was never mine to make. As we lay low, it all becomes clear as day. As my legs turn to stone, my mind suddenly starts to race. It all makes sense, and still I never thought I'd be the one to say whispers in the wind.
Saw someone up winning the mind, roaming up kitty to try numbing up.
We reach in the air.
Time's running out, end of a dry summer now, guessing the smile coming up.
All I've left in there.
I'm wondering, I don't know why, fuck with them, I don't know why I trouble them.
Wind is closing in.
I run with the kids in the ride, plumbing them, look to the sky, sending them. If I die, before I wake, I pray that Lord, ignore my hate. You feel me now, you bail me out my pain. And if I die before I wake, I thank the Lord for showing grace. You hear me out, you bail me out this case.
Now his body no longer moves. His heart still beats. His brain still thinks. His eyes still see.
Whispers in the wind, the way we reach in the air, with all I've left to mend. The wind is closing in.
Ashes to ashes, all hazards are active. I'm carefully fastened, glance at the blackness. Can't grasp with the absence, ain't there to be managed. Maps of the labyrinth, in hand but you can't just prepare for what's happening. Ashes to ashes, Ashes to ashes. Yeah.
Ashes to ashes.
I barely hit 20 with any of hope ration. Piss it all away, the tendency post crashes. But ashes to ashes, I walk this road lost and broke. And my cross has grown with those passes. But underestimate the growth I made. Cause my heartbeat let me know I grow from pain. And though my muscle tap from each burden, I feel certain they refurbish my feet working. I slip just to prove I can catch myself. Until my past feeling bitter, learn to check my wealth. I've been pressed on my mental health, but hear this, I'm still here, as clear as tears is. It's horizons beyond what see where hurt rises. Icarus ride with Phoenix, burn lightness. Scar tissue bled on my calluses, the pain's gone. I feel free, I'm renewing the day one.
I wanted to give a special thank you to Prempeh and Benjamin for a wonderful song. Thank you to Canadian Heritage for always supporting this project, and thank you to each and every single one of you for keeping these voices heard and educating yourself at a time where it hasn't ever felt more important. No matter what anyone says, friends, you are the culture. We are the culture, so go out there, keep making your voices heard, and let's keep building upon this ever-changing mosaic that is the Quebec identity. Thank you for listening, and have a great rest of your day.